All right, this video topic is actually going to be a series of videos. It's going to be on the Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath confusion. If that doesn't sound silly enough, the Seventh-day Adventists were so confused about the Sabbath. You're going to find these, at least next 3 videos I'm going to do, very interesting. This video here, this first one, is going to address what I'm just going to call the profoundly obvious problem of their almost 10 years of keeping the wrong Sabbath. Video number 2 is going to address the perhaps not so obvious but will have significant impact on this period of Sabbath confusion. And video number 3 is just going to address Ellen White's April 1847, which you're going to see here, Sabbath vision. Now, here's what I know and here's what we do know. The first SDA Sabbath-keeping church is pre-Great Disappointment, which I thought was interesting. And that's the spring of 1844, and we'll look at that church. We'll look at it here in Origins and Progress. Ellen White claimed to start keeping the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846. I'm going to address each one of these in the video. The Seventh-day Adventists, of course, they weren't a church then until 1863. I'm just going to call them Seventh-day Adventists because, well, they were organized, as they are, and as their beliefs were, even in 1844, after the 1840s. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church didn't really start keeping the Sabbath until this April of 1847 vision by Ellen White. Now, the Sabbath started and ended at 6 o'clock. Started at 6 o'clock, ended at 6 o'clock on the next day, which that was the Sabbath they kept from the autumn of 1846 until we could say November, December of 1855. We're going to start with the first SDA Sabbath-keeping church here. So here's a graphic from that very first Sabbath-keeping Seventh-day Adventist church in Washinton, New Hampshire. Look what it says. Birthplace of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and home of the Sabbath Trail. Now, we're going to read the history of that church that you just saw on that website, and we're going to read it here. Official Seventh-day Adventist book printed off God's printing press, which is the Review and Herald Press. And we're going to look at here in that history. So here it is right here. There is the Origin and Progress. You can see it's copyrighted in 1925. The one I held up was actually a second edition from 1926. And I want you just to see this picture here. I want you to see the woman responsible for the Seventh-day Adventists keeping the Sabbath. There she is, Seventh-day Baptist, Rachel Preston. Oh no, this isn't Bible study. This is Rachel Preston showing up in the church with a bunch of Seventh-day Baptist tracts, and she converted all these Adventists into Sabbath keeping. So no Bible study. Matter of fact, she's the one that converted them. Let's continue on to the next page where it really tells us that. You can see it was in the spring of 1844. That's before the Great Disappointment. We have the first SDA Sabbath-keeping church before the Great Disappointment. All right, Adventist Church, there it is, Washinton, New Hampshire. Rachel Preston, Seventh-day Baptist, shows up in this church with a bunch of tracts and converts all these Adventists into Sabbath-keeping Adventists. So there it is, the first official SDA Sabbath-keeping church, Washinton, New Hampshire, pre the Great Disappointment. Not my claim. It's the claim in Origin and Progress from God's printing press. Who made that claim? Not me. There it is, the first Sabbath-keeping church. Remember, that church is, you just saw their website. They are the birthplace of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Well, given that there was a successful conversion of that church by Rachel Preston, a Seventh-day Baptist, to convince them to keep the Sabbath, you got to ask yourself this question. What time did that church observe the Sabbath? Were they doing it at 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock, or were they doing from sunset to sunset? Well, this official SDA book that we just looked at doesn't tell us. But historically, the Seventh-day Baptist Church has observed the Sabbath from sunset to sunset. To confirm that, I wrote a letter to the General Conference of the Seventh-day Baptists and asked them that question, and you can see here is the letter I sent to them. Simple question. I just said, please can you tell me at what hours the Sabbath has been kept in the Seventh-day Baptist Church Did it ever change? And if so, let me know. Or is it consistent? So I left a pretty open question. This guy responded hour and a half later. I got it right from the GC of the Seventh-day Adventist General Conference, and he said, nope, since 1650s in England, it's been sunset to sunset. There you go. So in summary of this first little part, the first Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath church began observing the Sabbath in the spring of 1844 from sunset to sunset in the Seventh-day Baptist tradition. I thought that was interesting. By the way, I want you to know this. Ellen Harmon never kept a Sabbath, but Ellen White is the only one that kept Sabbath. You can see a picture here. I've seen this picture dated 1855, 1856, 1857, maybe even 1858, but this is one of the earliest known photographs of her. A couple of the dates do vary, and we also know that, well, Ellen, she was married August 30th of 1846. Now, Ellen White tells us, and we're going to see this in the literature here in a minute, it was in the autumn of 1846. So she was married in, as you saw, in August, but it was in the autumn after she was married that she began to observe the Sabbath, and it's the Sabbath of Joseph Bates. And she's going to tell us that too, and we'll read that too. So we're going to look, first of all, at this very influential book by anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christian Joseph Bates, who's going to make a case for the Sabbath. And he did this in a book in 1846. Here's the actual book here, and there's the source. You can actually go find this book online should you want to do that and read it. And here's just one page. This book is just full of justifications for keeping the Sabbath from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Here's just one of the many justifications that I found in this book, underlined in red. Bates said what? Then the Sabbath begins precisely at 6 o'clock. Okay, not 5:59, not 6:01, precisely at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. And everywhere on this globe, and it ends in the same period, etc. So, now I'm going to let Ellen White tell us that she knew the Sabbath, just like I said, of Joseph Bates, which is the 6 o'clock Sabbath. And no better place to do it than her own testimonies for the church. We're going to look here in this volume that I just held up. That's volume 1, 1948 edition. And she says this on page 75, and we're going to look on page 76 too. So start reading here, we'll click over to 76. In the autumn of 1846, remember she was married early in 1846. So shortly after she got married, she began to observe the Sabbath and to teach it and defend it. And she says, my attention was first called to the Sabbath while I was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, earlier in the same year. She became acquainted with Joseph Bates. He embraced the Adventist faith, active laborer, etc. So there it is. Ellen White becomes acquainted to the Sabbath, not the Sabbath of the Seventh-day Adventist from sunset to sunset, but the 6 o'clock Sabbath. Now, this 6 o'clock Sabbath is detailed in the controversy in a pretty modern book. It is clear that Ellen White followed the 6 o'clock Sabbath. All right, here is that modern book. And these are still printed and very much available on the Adventist website. Book all about Joseph Bates, 2004. I love it, by George Knight. And what does he say here on page 158? In spite of the fact that Seventh-day Baptists, from whom Bates initially got the Sabbath, observed it from sunset to sunset. Thank you very much, Mr. Knight, for confirming that for us. Bates himself argued for the 6 o'clock Sabbath in his 1846 book, which I just put a graphic on there for you to also see. So, the 6 o'clock Sabbath now is going to receive the official stamp and approval of God, because we're going to have speaking in tongues that's going to prove the Sabbath is 6 o'clock and it's from God. We're going to have tongues, we're going to have an interpretation, and they're so sure of this. And that James White, and you're going to see this in writing, he says it's Satan that's trying to get us off this time of 6 o'clock. Satan. Okay. Now, we're going to read this account by Arthur White. And this is volume, I think it's volume 1. This is volume 1 in the, I think it's 6-volume set. And you'll see here again, I mention it every time, but I do thank Mr. Arthur White for signing the book for us. Thank you very much, Mr. White. Privileged to have that in my library. Let's read his account of that here. So there it is, title page, copyright 1985. And really this is, he's trying to rescue Dear Ellen here. Because, I mean, just look at the title. a demonstration of tongues that misled. You are going to read a demonstration of tongues, and nowhere is it going to tell you that it was misled. This is Arthur White's after the fact trying to rescue Ellen White. But we're going to read that account, and nowhere did they feel they were misled. Matter of fact, they just kept observing the 6 o'clock Sabbath. So look what's underlined here in the middle of the page. About there was a demonstration of tongues that placed endorsement, and then he calls it, now he's reading into it here, an erroneous interpretation of Sabbath keep and Bates' time of 6 o'clock. We are now going to look at that actual event. Here it is here on page 199. There's been some division in Connecticut as to the time of the Sabbath. There were contenders saying, no, we ought to keep it from sunset to sunset, sundown to sundown. Oh no, it's 6 o'clock. And then they say, look at the underlined text here, a week ago Sabbath, we made this a subject of prayer. The Holy Ghost came down, Brother Chamberlain, filled with the power, he cried out in an unknown tongue, and the interpretation followed, which was, what? Give me chalk, and then, well, thought I, and this is James White, by the way, James White was saying, well, thought I, if there's no chalk in this house, I know this is going to be a fake interpretation, but some chalk showed up. Brother Chamberlain got it, took it, and in the power he drew a 12 o'clock, a 3 o'clock, a 6 o'clock. He drew the face of a clock. And then it goes on the next page. This is where James White said, it's Satan would get us off this time. Satan's trying to do things to get us off this 6 o'clock time. And that, what does James White then say about Brother Bates and his Sabbath? That God raised Brother Bates up to give us this truth. It's a God-given truth. The Sabbath is 6 o'clock and only Satan is going to take us off that time. Okay? And we just read now, you saw it where it was confirmed by tongues. And by the way, nobody in that account that you just read there said, oh no, this is a fake account of tongues and a fake interpretation. Arthur White's only adding that later. They surely didn't believe it in 1849 when it happened in 1848. So James White wrote, it's Satan that's going to get us off this time. And he called it God's Sabbath. Here's the first problem with this whole mess. Which Sabbath is correct? The first SDA church began keeping the Sabbath in the spring of 1844, sunset to sunset. In the autumn of 1846, Ellen White begins keeping the Sabbath of Joseph Bates, which is the 6 o'clock Sabbath. We got a mess here of Sabbath confusion between 6 o'clock and sunset to sunset. Problem 2. Given that Ellen White is the so-called spirit of prophecy, who's supposed to protect the church from error as claimed in the 28 Beliefs book, look with me here, as I've used this several times in several videos. Here we are on page 255, where it talks about the office of the spirit of prophecy, and part of its office is protect the church against false doctrines. So believers would no longer be infants tossed about to and fro by every wave of doctrine like 6 o'clock Sabbath time. Evidently, Ellen White was sleeping. So the other problem with this is this. Did Ellen White demand that the Washinton, New Hampshire church change their Sabbath time to 6 o'clock? Stop observing sunset to sunset. Start observing 6 o'clock. We had confusion reigning here. We got Ellen White and crew, 6 o'clock. We have the New Hampshire church, sunset to sunset. There's no documentation of Ellen White receiving a vision to correct the Washinton, New Hampshire church, or to chastise them, as she often did people, to do that. Again, Ellen White completely failed in her office as the spirit of prophecy. She's just a big failure. Problem 3. We see in the George Knight book, which you just saw a couple minutes ago, that they had a prayer meeting to determine the Sabbath controversy. Not a Bible study, but a prayer meeting. We're going to pray about this. How was that answer supposed to be received? By the way, if you're in any church and someone tells you to go pray about it, be careful, because this is often used as a mode of decision making. Go pray about it. Oh, okay, then what's going to happen? My left kidney is going to shake 3 times, and that's going to be the answer from God. I get a liver quiver, an answer to, I mean, what is that? That's what it often leads to, things like we see here in Adventism, excess doctrinal error. Yeah, you can pray about things and pray for guidance, but to make the prayer meeting itself say, oh yeah, we're going to pray about it, and pray about it they did, by the way. And and to receive an answer, and they did. And they got speaking in tongues, and they got interpretation of tongues that turned out to be false. This is not Christian decision making, by the way. There's a great book out there called Decision Making and the Will of God by Gary Friesen. I read it decades ago. And it deals with all this nonsense ways in Christianity and in Adventism that decisions are made. So anyway, we saw in this here where tongues actually confirmed the 6 o'clock Sabbath. Tongues, interpretation of tongues, got the chalk, drew it on the floor, and there we go. And you know what? There was no Bible study for a correct Sabbath. It was, let's just hold a prayer meeting and hope God talks to us. You know what? And God did talk to you. And all it did is tongues confirmed your 6 o'clock Sabbath, not Bible study. I want you to note here that Ellen White said she started to keep the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846. I call this the Ellen White secret Sabbath, because it's not stated in this book where she made that statement, which is here. It's not stated in this book when she started keeping the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846, right after she got married, but before the April of 1847 vision. That time frame between the autumn of 1846 and April of 1847 are Ellen White's personal, private Sabbaths. No message was given to the church to keep the Sabbath, just Ellen and James began keeping the Sabbath. Oh, isn't that quaint and cute? About half a year later, April of 1847, she gets the vision and to keep the Sabbath, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church begins keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath now moves from Ellen and James' personal private Sabbath to the universal Sabbath of the church. We are going to now look at her vision, which they put forth here. Thank you very much, Seventh-day Adventist, in a book I use all the time too. Her early writings book, 1882, which you can see here. It's a second edition, 1882. And she says what? The Lord gave me the following view in April 1847. Okay, so here it is, set up. It's coming from God. By the way, this was April. And then she says here, and it's all over. I'm just going to do this one here. She saw that the Sabbath was not nailed to the cross and that God had not changed the Sabbath. So here is the vision which tells everyone, you got to keep the Sabbath. Now, wait a second. She gets the vision in April of 1847. What Sabbath were they keeping in 1847? The Joseph Bates 6 o'clock Sabbath. She gets a vision from God or her angel, or masquerading, Satan masquerading an angel of light, saying keep the 6 o'clock Sabbath. Actually, it doesn't say to keep any Sabbath, 6 o'clock or sunset. It just says keep the Sabbath. Didn't her angel know what they were already doing? Perhaps her angel did and liked it. No need to correct what is already correct. I don't know. We can read into this all kinds of ways. I just want to say, is this vision true? Because if it is true, why did her spirit guide angel forget to whisper in her ear and say, psst, psst, by the way, Ellen, you got to change the 6 o'clock thing because it's really sunset to sunset. Forgot to do that, didn't he? From 1847 until 1855, Sabbaths are kept at 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Her guiding angel was kind of forgetful. Don't understand what happened there. It took a vision, by the way, to create the Sabbath doctrine. Remember, Ellen White said here she was already keeping the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846. If she was so convinced then why didn't she just come out to the church and say, hey, I've done Bible study on it. We don't need a vision on it. We're keeping the Sabbath. See, it didn't work like that. She had to go in vision and make up a Sabbath. Your Sabbath doctrine, Seventh-day Adventist, is not Bible study. It's all vision-based. Not a single Bible study. By the way, and so what did this first SDA church in Washinton, New Hampshire do during all this time? They'd been keeping the Sabbath since March of 1844. Did they relent? Did the Washinton, New Hampshire church say, wow, man, Ellen White, she's got a vision now about the Sabbath. We really got to change it to the 6 o'clock time. So I wrote the Washinton, New Hampshire Seventh-day Adventist Church and asked them that simple question you can see here, where I tell them, look, I understand you're the first Sabbath-keeping church, and it's the Seventh-day Baptist, which was sunset I put sunrise in there, sunset to sunset. And then I said I learned that between 1846 and 1855, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was keeping the Sabbath at a different time. In other words, what Sabbath did you keep? And what did this guy do? In so typical Seventh-day Adventist fashion, he doesn't answer the mail. He goes all over the place. He just doesn't answer the simple question. His answer is more concerned with identifying his church there as the first Sabbath-keeping church, but not the first SDA church. I didn't ask you that. All I asked is, which Sabbath did you keep? So let me say this. The 6 o'clock versus the sunset Sabbath was finally resolved in 1855 when J.N. Andrews presented a study to, I think it was the General Conference, or it was called a conference. And it was in November, later published in December of 1855. Let's look again here at this book where that is communicated to us. So where it says what? Andrews revised his earlier position on the topic, presented his results, which were later published in the Review and Herald of December 4th, 1855. Not until 1855 did the SDA Church keep a sunset-to-sunset Sabbath like they do today. You know what it took? It took J.N. Andrews, that we just read here, to correct the spirit of prophecy. And her forgetful spirit guide angel forgot to whisper in her ear and tell her to correct the 6 o'clock time. No, it took J.N. Andrews to correct Ellen White. Just how many doctrinally wrong Sabbaths did the SDA Church observe? Let's look month by month, and let's look at some fun facts as we do it. First, we have to figure out what was the first Sabbath that Ellen White ever kept. By the way, I wrote the White Estate and asked them that question. They still have not responded to me. Maybe they're still researching. You would think something this important they would know, but they don't. So Ellen White, again, said she kept the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846. What is the autumn of 1846? Autumn is September 23rd to December 21. That's what it was in 1846. There were 13 Sabbaths in the autumn of 1846. So I just picked one over the halfway point. I picked the 7th Sabbath in the autumn. There it is, November 7th. I'm going to call that the very first secret Ellen White Sabbath. So here commences Sabbath keeping. Let's go on to the next page. We got about 60 Sabbaths between 1846 and 1847, all kept at 6 o'clock. And by the way, I counted about 25 Ellen White secret Sabbaths that she kept starting in November 7th until the April of 1847 vision. So she had 25 secret Sabbath. There's our fun fact number one. Here we are in 1848, 1849. We got about 104 wrong Sabbaths. Here's a fun fact. So the Sabbath marks those who have accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior. If you are doing the 6 o'clock Sabbath, is Jesus Christ your Savior? Or do you have to do the sunset Sabbath? Let's go to 1850 and 51. We got another 104 wrong Sabbaths. Here's your fun fact. The Sabbath is what? It means eternal salvation, to keep the Sabbath unto the Lord. Is it eternal salvation if you keep the wrong one at 6 o'clock? Maybe we got to ask Ellen for clarification on that. Let's go to 1852, 1853. We got 105 more wrong Sabbaths. I like this one because, it's taught in Adventism that Adam and Eve kept the Sabbath. I want to know, what kind of watch did Adam have on his wrist so he knew? Remember, I said earlier, Bates said, we got to keep it exactly at 6 o'clock. Okay, Adam, what Sabbath were you observing? How did you know when 6 o'clock was? What kind of wristwatch did you have, Adam? Maybe Adventists will tell us that later. Here we are, 1854 to 1855, when it all ends. I'm just calling the end date November 24th. Total of 470 wrong Sabbath observations. The SDA Church is confused Sabbath-keeping church. In summary, the first Sabbath-keeping church is the Washinton, New Hampshire church, who did so in the spring of 1844. Ellen White began observing the Sabbath in the autumn of 1846, right after she got married, and was doing so, I guess, secretly, because it wasn't a church edict at the time, until April of 1847. There's no evidence I can find anywhere the Washinton, New Hampshire church changing their Sabbath times to coincide with the 6 o'clock Sabbath times of Ellen White and heretical founder crew. The 6 o'clock Sabbath was confirmed by speaking in tongues. Despite what Arthur White was trying to say here about it's wrong, they all believed it. You read the account. Everybody there believed it. Andrews comes out corrects the spirit of prophecy because her vision happened to be so non-specific, and her angel forgot to whisper in her ear and tell her that her Sabbath time was either right or it was wrong. He forgot. Maybe he was looking for his gold card and he got sidetracked. So it took Andrews to write a paper in 1855 to correct, he really corrected this vision of Ellen White, set the time to sunset. Then they published it in December of 1855. 470 doctrinal wrongs Sabbath were observed. Really? Is this God's end time church here? Seventh-day Adventist? We're God's end time remnant church. You had the Sabbath wrong for nearly 10 years. This Sabbath confusion right here is proof that the SDA is not God's end-time remnant church. Ellen White didn't receive anything from God. She got it from an angel She got it from an angel masquerading as an angel of light, no doubt about that, and her Sabbath vision. So Seventh-day Adventist, did you want to tell me that we keep the Sabbath because Ellen White got this vision here, and it is, in April of 1847? Well, that was a 6 o'clock Sabbath. So you should be keeping the Sabbath of the time of this vision, which is 6 o'clock. Or tell me that this vision is wrong. It's incomplete. God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14:33. And this means God is not behind the SDA church and their utter Sabbath confusion and their utter spirit of prophecy who was deceived, who is deceiving you and remains confused.